Hello everyone and welcome to Human Anatomy and Physiology 1, Body Organization. So to start off, we take a look at the difference between gross anatomy and microscopic anatomy. So gross anatomy or macroscopic anatomy is really just looking at structures of the body, organs of the body, systems of the body that can be viewed without a microscope. So, for example, you look at the heart. You can hold the heart in your hand. You can look at the chambers. You can study the valves. You can study the blood vessels. But you can also take the heart and zoom in, requiring a microscope, looking at muscle cells and fat cells, for example. And this is studying microscopic anatomy because it requires a microscope. So microscopic anatomy and macroscopic anatomy, that's the difference between the two. And the physiology part of the course is studying the function, how those different parts or how the anatomy works together. A lot of courses offer anatomy, like a whole year of anatomy and a whole year of physiology by themselves. Studying anatomy and physiology together definitely has its advantages because you can see how the anatomy works together, and then that's the physiology. Generally, anatomy is studied in lab, and the physiology is studied in lecture. Okay, the first thing we'll really get into is studying the levels of organization. And so it's important to know the order of the levels of organization. So if you want to start from small to large, we have the molecular level, you got the cellular level, then you have the tissue level, organ system, and then finally the organism. And so it's important to know the examples, to be able to give examples or to be able to recognize examples of each of the levels of organization. And so we'll kind of give you the definition as well as some examples at the same time. So you have the molecular level. You have your water, carbon dioxide, and so on, ATP. And you put molecules together, you put organelles together, you got yourself the cellular level. So once we get up to the tissue level, well, what makes a tissue? So you ask what makes a tissue. Well, two or more different kinds of cells working together will make up a tissue. All right, so we will get into tissues just shortly. So some examples of tissues would be muscle tissue, connective tissue like blood or cartilage or bone or ligaments and tendons, and or you could have epithelial tissue. So just taking one of those examples, say muscle, for example. If muscle is a tissue, then it should have two different kinds of cells working together. Well, it does. Muscle tissue has muscle cells or myocytes, as well as satellite cells, which are like your stem cells. So when a muscle cell dies, a satellite cell can differentiate into a functional muscle cell and take its place. So two different kinds of cells working together makes up a tissue. Then you got the organ level. Well, an organ is two different kinds of tissues. So just like a tissue is two different kinds of cells working together, an organ is two different kinds of tissues working together. And so you can, a good example of an organ is, for example, the skin. So in the skin, we have epithelial tissue, and we have blood vessels in the skin. So blood is a tissue, and epithelial tissue is tissue. Epithelia is tissue, which is the lining. Those two different kinds of tissues make up, and there's more, make up make up the skin, which we would call an organ. So that's an example of an organ. Of course, you have the liver, and you got the kidneys, and you got the ureter, and you have um, um, muscle. So these are all different kinds of organs. An organ system is two or more different kinds of organs working together. So you have the tissue level, two or more kinds of cells working together. The organ level, two or more kinds of tissues. Then you have an organ system, two or more kinds of organs. For example, the cardiovascular system, cardio meaning heart, vascular meaning blood vessels. The heart and the blood vessels obviously are very much interconnected. Cardiovascular system is an organ system. The cardiopulmonary system is another system. Cardio, heart, pulmonary, lungs. Students often get organ level and organ system level confused. They often interchange them or just get them confused because, well, they sound very close. So make sure to keep those straight when studying. Be able to recognize the examples, be able to give examples, so you can go back forward or backwards. And then finally, you have the organism, which is the highest level of all these levels of organization. And of course, the organism contains multiple organ systems, multiple organs and tissues and cells and atoms, of course. So that's the highest. Okay, very good. Now we'll get into studying very, very, very briefly the four main tissue types. And in the following chapters, we're gonna delve in and study in depth the four primary tissue types and the subtypes and so on. So right for now, we're just very, very, very doing a very brief overview. We got epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Histology is the study of tissues. Epithelial tissue is, for the most part, two kind of main kinds. You have two main types. You have the coverings, the linings. For example, our digestive tract is lined with epithelial tissue. Our trachea, our esophagus, our stomach, our body, the skin is made out of epithelial tissue. Respiratory, urinary tracts, lining. Well, we also have another kind, which is another type of epithelial tissue, which are the glands. Your sweat glands, your oil glands, these are also considered epithelial tissue. And so one major characteristic that's true of all epithelial tissue is that the cells are, for the most part, aligned soldier course. They're tightly knit, they're tightly joined, and with no matrix in between the cells. And you have direction. You have like an apical surface, and you have a basal surface. In epithelial tissue, you'll have at least one row of cells touching what we call the basement membrane. You can see the basement membrane here. And so there's direction. There's actually they're always oriented a particular direction. Tightly knit. Well, if this was your skin, this is not skin, but if this was your skin, then you would see, the air then, the outside of your body would be like out here, and the inside then would be down here. This is simple columnar epithelia, a subtype that we will learn in a coming chapter. And therefore, this would be a good example of like your stomach, the lining of your stomach. Okay, so connective tissue is like almost the opposite of epithelial tissue. Why? Well, because connective tissue, instead of being very tight-knit cells, to very tightly joined cells, well, here's a cell, here's a cell, here's a cell. They're not even touching. As a matter of fact, your connective tissue, for the most part, barely has any cells and instead is filled mostly with matrix, which is the protein fibers and ground substance made out of water. So so it's like, so connective tissue, generally speaking, is widely spaced cells with a whole bunch of matrix between the cells. It's totally the opposite of what we just talked about with epithelial tissue, where the cells are tightly joined, tightly knit together, like soldier cores. And another thing to take note of with connective tissue is it's the hardest of the four major tissue types to study because it's so broad. The range is so great. Where epithelial tissue you can kind of think of as, oh yeah, skin and linings and linings. Well, and you go to and you look at muscle, oh yeah, well, muscle is just muscle. Muscle is just muscle. Nervous is just nervous. Well, connective tissue has a huge, it's very broad in the kinds and the subcategories. For example, bone is connective tissue. Cartilage is connective tissue. Blood is connective tissue. Ligaments and tendons is connective tissue. Adipose is connective tissue. So where do you even start? That's why connective tissue tends to be the hardest to study, because it can range as far as what kinds there are. It's the subcategories. You have proper CT proper. You have fluid CT, which would be like your red blood cells and your white blood cells. And so on. So we'll get to that in the coming chapter as well. Then you have muscle tissue, the third major kind of tissue type. Muscle tissue is one big characteristic with muscle, of course, is that it provides locomotion. Of course, we have skeletal muscle that attaches. It's called skeletal because it attaches to our skeleton. It pulls on our bones, allows us to move. You have cardiac muscle that pumps the blood. The heart is a pump. Cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. And then you have smooth muscle, which is all other kinds of muscle. For example, the muscle that surrounds our blood vessels, that allow our blood vessels to vasoconstrict and vasodilate, is smooth muscle. The muscle within glands, the little muscles that allow our hairs to stick up, all the muscle that allows the food to move from the mouth all the way to the anus is smooth muscle, undergoing peristalsis. When you urinate, that's smooth muscle allowing the flow of urine to move through the urinary system. Reproductive tracts, smooth. This is all smooth. Now you might ask yourself, why is it called smooth? Well, because of what it looks like. You'll have you have skeletal muscle with these zebra prints. It takes like a month to go through this. We're going to go through these zebra prints. This is striated. They look like stripes. Skeletal muscle is striated. And cardiac muscle is also striated. Well, smooth muscle is called smooth because it looks smooth in the microscope. It doesn't have those striations, the zebra print, like you do with skeletal and cardiac. So, and then you start asking yourself, in the microscope, how can I tell the difference between cardiac and skeletal? Well, cardiac is branched, and it also has these intercalated discs, which mark the beginning of one cell and the end of another cell. And so we're going to study that once we get to the tissue chapter coming up. Another function of muscle, so we talked about movement, we talked about pulling on bones, locomotion, pumping heart, pumping blood, through the body. We talked about smooth muscle, like moving food, moving urine, moving stuff through through our tracts. Another big one that students tend to forget is the stabilization of body temperature. We are at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit because of skeletal muscle. Because skeletal muscle, when it works, it wastes a little bit of energy, but that waste isn't waste. It goes into keeping our body, maintaining our body temperature at 98.6. So it's the reason why we need blankies at night. Why do we always cool down and we get cold? Well, because we're not contracting our skeletal muscles. Therefore, our muscles cool down because there's no more waste, and therefore our body gets colder. And actually, our bodies do drop by a few degrees. Our bodies prefer to actually cool down a little bit at night, but we still throw on our blankie because we get cold. So there are some functions of muscle, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth, and a little bit of how we can recognize the difference between them in the microscope. And finally, nervous tissue, neural tissue. We have two kind of like major kinds of cells. We have neurons, which we tend to think of as the ones that send and receive signals to our toes and our skin and our stomach, up to the brain, back and forth. And then we have the supporting cells, neuroglia. And so then once we get to the nervous system, at the end of the semester, we'll talk about all the different kinds of neuroglia that we can find up in the brain. And so we'll delve into that, of course, at the end of the semester. And then you can divide the nervous tissue into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central meaning consisting of the brain and the spinal cord. Peripheral is everything else, like your arms and legs and so on. And so here's an example of this light blue here would be like one neuron, and here's a supporting cell here. Here's some more supporting cells, and they are very intricately work together to carry out nervous function. All right, another thing that we're going to talk about is homeostasis and feedback loops. All feedback loops have three basic parts. You have the receptors, which pick up information and send them to the control center. Control center tends to be the brain. And then lastly, you have the effector, which is the organ that finally brings out the change in the body. And so we'll take a look at, so if we break this up, we have negative feedback loops and we have positive feedback loops. Negative feedback loops are the most common of the two. They are constantly working right now. They are working in your body right this very moment. You may have no positive feedback loops working right now, or for a week, or for a month, or for a year even. But negative feedback loops are constantly occurring. They're occurring right this very moment. And the reason why they're called negative is not because they take the body in a negative direction or down if you're looking at a graph or anything like that. The reason why they're called negative is because negative feedback loops reverse. They reverse the direction that your body was going in. In other words, they bring your body back to the set point. So if your body is going, for example, we have thermoregulation, keeping your body at 98.6. Well, to do that, you have negative feedback loops constantly occurring. If your body is, let's say you go out in the sun, there's a heat wave, you go out in the sun, your body gets hot. This means that if we're looking at a graph, your body would be rising, 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 rising. Well, we don't want to keep going in that direction, deviating further away from the set point. Therefore, your sensory neurons in the skin will send a signal up to the brain. The brain will send a signal, so that would be the first part of the feedback loop. Brain, second part, which would be the control center, and then the effectors would be, for example, your sweat glands. For example, sweat glands will release water, will release sweat, and cause, and of course, the sweat contains heat, and therefore, when it dissipates, when it evaporates, it takes away the heat with it, and therefore, your body will begin to reverse direction and go back to the set point, which is why it's called negative, because the negative feedback loops reverses the direction, and even this way, you will undergo, you get too cold, thermogenesis. Your hairs will stand up to create like a little blankie, or you'll get so goosebumps and hairs, or you'll get the when you'll shiver. Another thing that can happen is vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Your blood vessels are also a part of this feedback loop for thermoregulation. You're getting too hot. What do the capillaries, what do the blood vessels near your skin do? They vasodilate in order to bring more blood closer to your skin, and that way you can bring more heat closer to your skin. That way it can dissipate easier. Well, what's right next to your skin? The air. So that way heat can be released. And actually the other direction, when your body is getting too cold, those blood vessels close to your skin, in your skin, will vasoconstrict. Therefore, that way there will be less blood in your skin, therefore less heat is lost, and bringing and therefore helping to raise that blood temperature once again. So that's negative feedback loop, and there's a lot of negative feedback loops. Some examples are blood sugar regulation, with insulin and glucagon, and and we'll study this in anatomy and physiology. Well, it could be 1 or 2 when we do the endocrine system, and maybe even in the digestive system. There's blood pressure regulation. When you drink and eat too much water and salt, blood pressure goes up. Well, your blood vessels can help with this negative feedback loop by increasing the diameter, by vasodilating, in order to release some of that, in order to decrease some of that blood pressure, that increased blood pressure. So so even your blood vessels can vasoconstrict and dilate to regulate blood pressure. And so that's another one. And here's you have blood sugar regulation is another one with insulin and glucagon. Every time you have a meal, insulin, your blood sugar goes up, insulin is released from the pancreas, and so you have your to decrease blood sugar, and those are some examples. We also have positive feedback loops. Positive feedback loops now are the other way around. Instead of being very common and constantly occurring, we generally think of negative feedback loops as the one that's linked to homeostasis, but actually both are both bring the body back to homeostasis. Positive feedback loops just do it the other way around. Why is it called positive? When your body deviates from the set point, a positive feedback loop will cause your body to continue in that direction, further deviating from the set point in order to bring about homeostasis. Well, you think, well, how's that even possible? Well, because eventually the body will stop that loop completely. It'll stop the whatever it is doing, and so it just sort of speeds up. You could say it speeds up the process, or the loop, the process, and therefore makes it. So let me give you some examples. The milk letdown reflex. The milk letdown reflex is very rare. It hardly occurs. It's not something that's constant, like thermal regulation. So what happens with the feedback loop? Well, with a milk letdown reflex, well, you have receptors. So here would be like the receptor. The baby sucking on the nipple sends a signal up to the brain. Here's your pituitary gland, and that would be, the brain would be the control center. Control center sends oxytocin and prolactin into the blood, and those two hormones eventually reach the mammary glands. So then the mammary glands would be an example of the effector, or the gland that finally brings about the change. What do the mammary glands do? They secrete milk, and increasing the direction it was originally going instead of decreasing. So you make more milk, and then the baby sucks more, and then you make more, and then the baby sucks more, and you make more. So it's further deviating from the original status, if you will, or the original set point, because you had no milk at one point. You had no milk, and so making milk, and then it causes you to make more and more and more milk, isn't bringing you back to the set point, which was no milk. No, it's causing you to create more and more and more and more milk. Another example of positive feedback loops is labor, going into labor, parturition. When the baby pushes on the uterus, this causes a sensation up to the brain, and the baby, the mother up in the pituitary gland, again up in the control center, secretes oxytocin, the same hormone, oxytocin. Oxytocin gets dumped in the blood, reaches the uterus, and the muscle of the uterus contracts, pushing the head of the baby on the cervix, which causes another stimulation, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, causing the baby, again, push until the baby is out. How is that positive? Well, because the baby pushes harder and harder and harder and harder and harder. Eventually it'll stop, but in that time, it's further deviating from the set point, meaning that it is a positive feedback loop. So those are some good examples of positive feedback loops. You also have clotting. When you get a cut, the clotting is another one. Okay, well, we're almost done with the chapter. We just have some anatomical orientation type terminology that we'll talk about. Anatomical position is very important to understand. When you are in anatomical position, you stand up, your hands are supine, meaning your hands are facing forward, and you look like this girl on the right. She is in anatomical position. That's important because we have, if you just relax, your thumb will come in, right? It'll rotate like this, and well, we have bones. We have bones in here, We have the radius and we have the ulna, and the ulna is medial and the radius is lateral. But when you cross, parts of those bones will also cross, and therefore the distal end of your radius will now be medial. And so, well, which is it? Is the radius medial or lateral? So it's when we speak, we're always referring to the body when it's in an anatomical position, which is that position. Um, Anatomists and doctors and nurses use these use the four abdominal pelvic quadrants and the nine abdominal pelvic regions. Doctors and nurses tend to use the four when assessing patients, and you'll learn that when you go into, if you are going into nursing or med school. And anatomists and chiropractors, they tend to use the nine abdominal pelvic regions. And so I'm not going to expect you to memorize which organs belong to which region at the moment, because we're just starting. But just memorize that this one is the upper right quadrant, upper left quadrant, and so on. And memorize these names here. Epigastric means above the stomach. The stomach is right. You can see it. The stomach is kind of right here, above the stomach. Below, hypogastric, below the stomach. What does hypochondriac mean? Well, chondro means cartilage. So chondrocyte means cartilage cell. So the region below the cartilage right here, you have your ribs. Well, your ribs are bone, but these ribs right here are actually cartilage. So part of our ribs are cartilage. So below the ribs here is your hypochondriac region. So that's why it's hypo. So then you just have your right and your left. Remember, it's always your patient is looking. It's always these words are always referring to your patient, always. In the medical field. So chiropractic, it's the other way around, but it's always referring to your patient. In other words, this is the right upper quadrant because it's your patient's right. All right. And then inguinal here and here. All right. We'll use like these ones on the right here, superior and inferior. And these words, superior and inferior, generally refer to like the trunk and the head. For example, your nose is superior to your mouth, but your mouth is inferior to your nose. Your eyes are superior to your nose. We also use proximal and distal. Proximal and distal we tend to use for our appendages, our arms and our legs. So we would say, so if I asked you, your knee is what to your ankle, you would say your knee is proximal to your ankle. Why proximal? Because it's closer to the attachment. It always refers to where the arm or where the leg is being attached. It's proximal. It's closer to the attachment. Your knee is closer to the attachment than your ankle is. And your ankle is distal to your knee. And your knee is distal to your hip. But we generally wouldn't say your knee is superior to your ankle, although technically it's correct, but we tend to use we like to use the words distal and proximal. And then finally we have lateral and medial. Medial meaning closer to the midline, towards the midline, and lateral meaning away from the midline. Therefore, your ear is lateral to your eye. Your ear is lateral to your eye. Your eye is medial to your ear because it's closer to the midline. And then we also have anterior and posterior. Your chest is anterior to your back. Your back is posterior to your chest. Now, we also have some other words, but we don't have to do them. For animal physiology, you also have cranial and caudal and ventral and dorsal, which also work, but it helps with animal physiology because animals that are on all fours, well, their head, would you say that their head is superior? Well, you wouldn't say their head is superior. You say their head is cranial and caudal, and their back would be, because their back, oh yeah, their back is superior, right? Because it's up. Well, because it's, yeah, it would be, but because they're on all fours, you would say dorsal. But anyway, we'll focus on these guys over here, and as well as anterior and posterior. We also got some planes. We got some planes. The plane, this purple one, the plane that cuts your body into front and back, anterior and posterior planes or sections would be the frontal plane. Frontal, front and back. The frontal one, it's also called the coronal because like a crown, like you'd put a crown on your head. That's called the frontal plane. Front and half sections like this. You also have transverse sections like this. Transverse planes cut your body into top and bottom halves, or you could say superior and inferior halves. All these planes, this direction are transverse planes. And then this way is your sagittal plane. Sagittal planes divide the body into left and right halves. This is sagittal, this is sagittal, all these are sagittal, left and right. The one that's right down the middle that bisects your body perfectly into left and right is called your mid-sagittal plane, into perfect halves. Mid-sagittal. So make sure to have those and know examples. The definitions. What does a frontal plane divide your body into? What is a sagittal plane? What does a transverse plane divide your body into? All right, though, that's pretty much it. We also have body cavities. You have your thoracic cavity here. You have your abdominal pelvic cavity here. Inside, you also have your pericardial cavity, your pleural cavity, and we have some terms like visceral, and parietal, which refers to all of our organs are inside of little baggies, but those baggies are also originally, you can think of them as kind of like balloons filled with water, and like the heart, for example. You can see it's in a baggie, but the baggie itself has like 2 layers. So this side of the baggie, this side of the pericardial sac, is the visceral side because it's touching the viscera, meaning the organ. And this side is the parietal side because it's touching the inside of your chest then. It's not touching the organ, it's touching the other side. So you have parietal and you have visceral for every single organ. All the lining that's touching your organ, touching your GI tract, the actual lining that's touching your GI tract would be considered the visceral peritoneum. And then as it wraps around like this and touches the inside of your belly now, of the abdominal pelvic cavity, it's actually touching the abdominal pelvic cavity, is not called your visceral peritoneum, but your parietal peritoneum. So you have visceral and you have parietal as far as layers. Again, this is the parietal side, and this is the visceral side. And then the second word will refer to what we're talking about. Pericardium, or plural, pleura for lungs, parietal, pleura, or visceral pleura, and so on. In the tummy here, in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we say peritoneum. Here's the word, peritoneum. Okay, well, that concludes body organization for anatomy and physiology. Thank you very much, guys, and study well. Thank you.